For those people who wanted to go over the ESS quiz, I just want to make a screencast just to make sure that we're talking through some of the answers. So the lighting in this room is a little bit odd right now, and I wrote the answers out in kind of a pinky orange marker, so they're not the easiest to see. But I'm just going to run through them pretty quick, and I'll pause where I think there might be issues, okay? Again, if you are uncertain about anything, please do ask because it's a good time to talk about them. Similar questions will probably be on your unit test. It will come up, in a few weeks. So you just want to make sure that if you have those questions, you clarify them now instead of putting them off because you're likely to forget about them, okay, as other things come up in other classes. So just make sure you ask if you need to. So first, I think everybody got the first question right. So a biome was just a collection of ecosystems sharing the same climatic conditions. So perfect. The second one, deserts are usually found. We look at latitudes between the temperate and tropical forests. So if we just look at the wording of the other options, so it says higher latitudes than the tundra. So higher, if we're looking at latitudes, remember latitudes are those like horizontal stripy lines across the earth, just dividing it into sections. Okay, so this is latitude. Longitude is actually the other way, but we didn't talk about that in this section, so I'll leave that off. The equator is 0 degrees latitude. And then we can count up or down from there, so we can go into larger and larger numbers up to 90 degrees for the northern hemisphere and down to 90 degrees for the southern hemisphere. And this is the main way of marking it. So you could just go, 90 degrees north is our max, and 90 degrees south is our max in the southern hemisphere as well. So if we're thinking about the first one, it says latitudes, oops, sorry, I think we looked at D first. So higher latitudes than the tundra. So the tundra, remember, I'm trying to switch colors. The tundra we said is, I'm just going to shade in a region, is, pretty far north. So, and, if there were more land, then we'd expect fairly far south as well because there's land in the northern hemisphere in that section. So that's going to be like our northern band of land, right? So more north than that, really, we're just looking at, ice. So ice pack. So we're not going to go into higher latitudes. Okay, so not higher. It would have to be lower to move closer to the equator. The lower latitudes in the temperate and tropical forests, well, this is just kind of a confusing one because lower than the temperate forests, okay, that's fine. We could definitely go lower than the temperate forests. So if we say the temperate forests are kind of in toward the middle section, okay. Let's say they're toward the middle. This is not perfect. This is me just sketching stuff in. Okay, sure. We could go lower and that would be fine. But the tropical forests themselves hover. I don't have that many colors, so here we go. So the tropical forests are right around that equatorial zone. So, I mean, that's as low as we can go. That's 0, so we can't go lower than 0. Last one, so latitudes, let's see, did I cover them? No, we have to go out to the top. Latitudes between the tundra and temperate forests. So again, it would be these two zones. So if we're looking at the main location of deserts, the main location of deserts is actually further south. So it's not going to be in this zone. In fact, if we go between the temperate and the tundra, we're likely to hit that, boreal zone or the coniferous forest or the taiga. We said there's a bunch of ways that you can name that one. And that would be more in between the temperate and the tundra, okay, or the temperate deciduous forest and the tundra. Okay, so that would be our best answer as being C. 3, almost everyone got this spot on, so the two factors that we used to identify the biome were temperature and precipitation. So those are just our climatic factors. I'm going to ignore my strange note off to the side, so that was just something I needed to remind myself of. For the picture, the best answer, and we're looking for a specific, would be a tropical rainforest. And it is worded this way, so state the type of ecosystem. So looking at these questions, so type of ecosystem, okay? If we said a biome was a grouping of ecosystems, then this ecosystem could be classified as a temperate rainforest. So that's perfect. I think almost everyone in this class got that spot on. Then we're looking here generally at the biodiversity and productivity. We had some amazing answers in this class. really, we didn't need any details about the primary the primary or secondary, the net or gross productivity. All we're looking at is just productivity in general, and we could get this information from the POGIL that we did in the biomes. And within there, all we have to say is that this area has high biodiversity, and some people explain that that meant there's a large variety of plants and animals and organisms. And then we have high productivity, and some people went into the detail just saying that that would mean that there was lots of available precipitation, and it was warm enough for things to grow year-round and thrive. So we'll flip. Okay. Oops. Outline the global distribution of this type of ecosystem. And it's 2 points, so we need some details, but we're looking for a couple main points. So we're looking at maybe the continents where you might find it, and some people listed that. Some people just listed generally around the equator, and then some people listed like climatic conditions in which you'd find them. And that's all totally acceptable. Okay? So those are wonderful, acceptable answers, 100%. So, if you don't know the continents, then remember, if we're looking at around that 0 degrees, we're thinking, Africa, South America, and Asia. So those are the places that we're looking. Some people just laid out that there had to be lots of available precipitation and, through the equator, which means it receives a high concentration of sunlight and it's warm year-round. So those things we're looking for. And those are all great answers. So those are great elements to a strong answer. 5, so explain the precipitation to evaporation value of less than 1. So remember, less than 1, that just means so remember, we don't know the actual number, so we don't know how much it rained, we don't know how much of the water evaporated, we don't have the quantities. All we know is that the evaporation has to be much greater than the precipitation if it's less than 1. So I'm just making arrows. So this one has to be the big one. Okay, this one has to be our bigger number. If that's the case, then we know this area is drying out. Some people in one of the other classes went into details just saying that that means that water from the soil is moving upward and evaporating at the surface. Maybe we leave salt deposits behind. But we need to have the understanding that that means that we're lacking water. It's a dry area. And the most reasonable response to select would be that this would be consistent with a desert region. Okay, it's dry, it's drying out. For 6, we got a whole bunch of answers, so we looked for 2 characteristics of pioneer plants. Some people defined a pioneer plant, and that's not really what we're looking for. We're really thinking about characteristics, like what makes a certain plant work as a pioneer plant. Like, what are its characteristics, what are its attributes that allow it to survive in these areas where most organisms cannot. So some people said that there are selected species, they have many young, they could be carried there by wind, they have short life cycles, they enjoy open areas where they get lots of sun, they're small, they can live in poor soil. All of those things are totally acceptable. And we had a huge variety of responses. I think the most common one, just so you know, is lichens. So if you see lichens and mosses are probably the 2 most common responses. So if you don't know those, just kind of memorize that. So if you ever asked a question about that, those are 2 excellent pioneer plants, okay? Then if we look, distinguishing between primary and secondary succession, almost everyone got this one correct as well. So primary, we said we're starting from bare rock where there's no soil. Secondary, we're starting from an area that had soil or had been previously inhabited, and there was some type of disturbance to reset the event. And at the bottom, we just had to list some sort of disturbance that would reset the succession, so it would lead us into secondary succession. Some people chose fire, volcanic eruption. Remember, if you say volcanic eruption, that you might want to specify a volcanic eruption where there is no new rock formed, but there is ash. And there are a bunch of other things. In fact, some people, I think, in this class got a little bit more creative and said things like, oh, a farming zone or an area that was deforested. and then left to regrow. And those are all fabulous answers as well. Okay, so just thinking about what would reset that process. Here, for the first one, it just said to fill in the blanks. We're just looking for some type of comparative words. I was not very picky about the comparative words that you chose. So it says biodiversity. I went low, high. We're just trying to go with comparative between the very early stages of succession and later stages of succession. So low, high is fine. For the size of organisms, we're thinking about the average size of organisms, okay? So we start out with these smaller organisms. True, we know that. Toward the end, if we're picturing our climax community, it's going to have larger organisms than the original stage of succession, or the early stages of succession. So even though it's true that there will be a variety of sizes of organisms, because that's normal, it would be like if we averaged the size of the organisms or the biomass of each individual organism, okay, we would see that the average mass of each organism would be higher because we'd be including larger things, maybe like trees or large animals, right? So that would just increase the average size of the organisms. Distinguish between the R and K selected species. So this is going to keep, this has come up a few times, so now we just should know it. So the R species are the ones that have tons of offspring. They mature really quickly. They have a short lifespan. I don't know if I said this, they're quick to mature. The K species are the ones that take a really long time to mature. They don't produce that many offspring. They tend to be slow growing. So if we think about animals, I always think, people are a good example of K-selected species, and then R-selected species, if we're thinking about animals, we like insects, okay? But of course, plants fit this mold as well. So R-selected species, you could think about things like, even like photosynthetic algae would reproduce fairly quickly. And K-selected species, if you're thinking about, large trees, so a sequoia or an oak or a huge pine tree, it takes a really long time for them to grow to maturity. Right. So looking at the organic matter, everyone in this class did very well with this. So we looked at the increase in organic matter as succession occurs. So thinking about the POGIL again, we can think about death and decay as organisms die, they break down, they become part of the soil, and then we can think about the defecation or the feces left behind by animals that move into the area. So it's like the more stuff we have, the more organic matter we have, the better soil we tend to have, etc., etc., etc. So this is a really, really good example of what could be viewed as a positive feedback loop. So it's like the more organisms we have, the better soil we have. The more organisms we have, the better soil we have. Just because, if we're thinking overall in general, the more plants, the more leaf litter and potential decomposition of those organisms, the more animals, potentially the more manure that we'll have as well. So of course we know there's more to it there's more to it than that, but just thinking that we could see this as one of those loops as well. Identify a potential area of zonation. So the best responses would just be the tidal zone and the mountains. I had a little bit of a debate with myself about some people's responses because some people wrote things like the beach or the shore, and just remember that everyone's experience of things like the beach is not exactly the same. So I know if you go to the beach and you live by the Mediterranean or you live by the ocean, then you do see the tidal zone. But if you like me, grew up somewhere in the middle of a continent, the beach could be an area that's just a small lake that has some nice sand, so there is not going to be a tidal zone there. So it's a little bit different, but a lot of people who said one of those things kind of went on to explain what they meant, and I think that was okay. So the factors that we're looking at are changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, changes in altitude, water availability, etc., depending on what you chose. And then last one, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I'm discussing these for the people who want to go over their quiz and their responses. So if we look, the last one is choosing these locations. So first it says identify the location that is the equator. So our best choice is D. I know it's not perfectly aligned, but D is our best location. So location D is location of the equator. We see there, well, first off, it does say tropical tropopause, so in that tropical region. We see the tricellular model, so as we're going toward the equator up toward, here it just says polar cell, but we could be moving toward the pole. I'll say the North Pole or the South Pole, okay? It doesn't matter. I would generally say the North Pole because I've lived almost my entire life, or well, my entire life in the Northern Hemisphere. So if we're looking, we also see that cloud accumulation here and some precipitation. So that's an indication too that that's a good tropical zone. So we're getting that precipitation in that location as well. And then where the deserts occur, so this is where we need to kind of go over that tricellular model and think about what we know about it. So we're looking at these convection cells. So here, as warm moist air rises, the air is going to cool, the water will condense, and it falls right here. And then we're trying to figure out, okay, where's our dry zone going to be? So we actually see something similar, though not quite as extreme here, where we have air rising, we have some clouds forming. Okay, we imagine probably going to get these little lines I'm drawing are supposed to be precipitation. So there we go. So there's probably going to be some precipitation in this zone as well. But if these air masses have dumped their water, essentially, so they've dumped their water, as they circulate, so as this Hadley cell circulates, okay, this way counterclockwise, and as the Ferrel cell circulates clockwise into this zone, all right, they're going to be very dry. It lost its moisture. And here we have that, if you think the air pushing down, we have that high pressure zone, okay? So high pressure combined with very dry. So this is going to be a sunny, dry place. And the location here really is not going to be too far from the equator. So it's not terribly, terribly far from the equator. So not too far away to have, a desert region. Okay, so we'll still, compared to our most northern part, it still is going to have enough solar radiation to heat up the surface as well, so it can still be a fairly warm location. Do remember though, just so you remember, the desert actually is based primarily on precipitation, so it doesn't even necessarily need to be extremely hot. We often associate that with the desert, but there are desert regions too that can be extremely hot in some parts of the year and then fairly cool in the other parts of the year. It doesn't have to be like, unbearably hot all the time. So our best location for our desert is C, and then for part C, then we're looking at why this would be here, and I got kind of crazy and wrote a bunch of stuff. So some people just wrote stuff about it being warm and receives a direct sunlight. Some people wrote the high pressure and it's dry. Please do think about always incorporating information that you know from the diagram. Okay, so this one is just asking you to identify. So identify is pick a location, pick a location. But when it's asking you now to explain something and we're supposed to be referring to the tricellular model here, try and refer back to it. Okay, think about what we know about it. Think about maybe the rain falling near the equator and the air then moving towards C from both sides, actually, from the mid-latitudes and from the equator, is going to be very dry. The high pressure, all of those things are good things to incorporate just to make a very, very comprehensive response. And that's what we're going for, okay? Oh, I just noticed now that this does say Southern Hemisphere on that side. So I wasn't just being, I don't know how you'd say it, like biased to my hemisphere. All right, perfect. So when you get this, please remember, if you can, always refer to the diagram, especially with an explain. And think about 2 points means you got to go a little bit more in depth. This one you're also given quite a bit of space. I wrote a lot here just because there's, I think, there's many potential responses. So usually on the key or the mark scheme, they give potential responses that are positive or that are going to earn you those points, and they don't actually expect students necessarily to hit all of those points, so they're just looking for a couple of them, or a few of them depending on the number of points that the question is worth. So if it's 2 points, try to hit at least a couple points that are solid that you can associate with that answer, okay? So overall, everyone, you did very well. So we will have, an exam or a test in a few more weeks, and you're going to see this content again. So just make sure that if you didn't get anything that you ask me. All right? Have a good evening.